Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock, host of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. For those new to the program, this podcast is focused on how parents should custom tailor their parenting style to fit what's best for their families, themselves, and most importantly, their kids. Today I'm talking to Nancy McDermott. She is a good friend and the author of the book, The Problem with Parenting. Hey, Nancy.
Hey, Julie, how are you?
I'm doing great, and I'm so glad to have you on. And actually, this is your second appearance. So, for those who might not have caught one of the first episodes of the Bespoke Parenting Hour, Nancy was one of my first guests. She appeared in August 2020. What is significant about August 2020? Oh, that's right. Schools didn't open. So Nancy came on. She was talking about her new book, but we were, of course, also able to talk about sort of what was going on in the country. Which at that time, Nancy's a mom. She has school age kids. I was, dealing with my school age kids, and it was all a big question mark. And so we were kind of grappling with that issue, but I thought it would be interesting to bring Nancy back. We are now 2023. It's been 3 years since the closure of school, since the you sort of when COVID was really, raging in the country in different variations. So it didn't ever seem to end because we would always have a new variant that would come out. And again, it's been 3 years. So I thought it would be interesting to check back in with her, and kind of go over some of the things that we've seen since then and what's happening in schools today. And in addition to learning loss, we've seen the deployment of some of these really questionable theories into the school curriculum, whether that's sorry about the dog. I know you know what I'm dealing with, Nancy. Whether that's critical race theory or sort of the gender theory in schools, we've seen theories, um, and we've also seen statements from schools that are sort of determined to provide this gender affirming care, keeping secrets from parents, that kind of stuff. It's schools are fraught today. It is just a fraught sort of atmosphere. But I think a lot of those things, from the deployment of some of these very radical theories to, again, pornography in the schools, it all points to one thing, and that is sort of this loss of childhood, loss of innocence, or trying to introduce really mature concepts to kids at a very young age. So Nancy, I know that was quite a long intro there, but I wanted to talk to you about the whole point of childhood, what it is, what it was, what it used to be, when that whole concept came about, um, and sort of get your thoughts on that. And again, your book was sort of examining parenthood, and when I thought it was fascinating because I love talking to you about like how parenting as we know it today really sort of developed in the 1970s. So I thought we could take a similar look at when childhood sort of emerged as a concept and something that people actually have to sort of go through. So anyway, why don't you start off here telling me, what is childhood?
Right. Well, um, childhood, as we understand it, really got going in the late 16th century with the development of the bourgeois family. And people, and that might sound a little bit crazy because, of course, there have always been children. But what was different from what existed before that time was that before that time, childhood was it was basically a time of maturing, um, and there wasn't a strong understanding of the differences between children and adults. They were just kind of considered less competent adults, and the whole sort of trajectory of maturation was to become a replacement for the last generation. So there wasn't a lot of innovation, there wasn't a lot of education, and all of that begins to change in late 16th century because you have this very ambitious new class in Europe, which would later become known as the bourgeoisie, and they. Unlike the aristocracy or the other classes before them, they didn't just have to raise replacements. they had to raise up children who could better themselves, and who could, take the family forward, take themselves forward, and also take society forward. And so what happened was that childhood became more than just a phase of maturation. It became a phase of socialization, of really uh, helping kids to develop the social nous that they would need to get on, but also it became a period of education. And the education was important because there was a lot more technical knowledge that was required. It required a longer period of time for children to really be able to not just mature, but to stand on the shoulders of the generation that came before them, because education is this kind of generational transfer of knowledge that allows generations to progress over time and to do bigger and better things. So that's basically how childhood came about, and eventually. Oh, sorry.
Well, I want to ask a question. So you're saying that the concept of childhood, of having a time to mature, to learn, to educate, to become educated, sort of evolved or came about with when the bourgeoisie came about. And before that, without there really being a bourgeoisie, was it just that children were born in poorer families? Because did childhood exist with royalty, for instance, or with was this done? Because I mean, children were educated before the 16th century, so I'm just trying to understand. This became a more common thing among people who were not at the very sort of elite status.
Right. Well, the way to look at it, I think, is that uh, when you raised a child, you were raising them to take your place. And so you would need to teach them what they needed to know to take your place. So if you're a monarch, you need to speak multiple languages. You might need to be a warlord. If you're a blacksmith, like if you've read the wonderful Hilary Mantel Tutor series, which I really recommend, it's a really interesting vision of what childhood was like. So you had Thomas Cromwell, who is born the son of a blacksmith. His father's abusive, they don't get on, but another adult takes him under his wing. He eventually becomes a mercenary. Then someone else takes him under his wing. He becomes a merchant, and eventually, he ends up as this advisor to Henry VIII. And the interesting thing about that is that you can sort of see that as like a transition, because he didn't just replace his father,
He
or just
exceeded.
replace somebody in his village. He actually rises through society, and that's what education begins to be about. It's about rising through society, and it's also importantly like a protected time, a time when you're not throwing too much on the shoulders of kids because you know that they need that extra time. And eventually that becomes formalized in schools, and the period that children will be in schools extends until, eventually you get, I'd say that the high point of it was probably in the Victorian family. Um, but obviously survived in new forms and new variations up until the 70s, when it all fell apart.
Well, yes, and we'll get to that, but it's interesting that you talk about you sent me eh, some thoughts on this, and you talked about how it wasn't just about existing in the world. What you talk about, like replacing your parents, essentially doing what they're doing, but really learning about the world and becoming comfortable in the world, and sort of making it their own. And that brings with it innovation to improve the world. I mean, I think that that's kind of why people innovate and why they want to make the world a better place. So that really sort of emerged with this concept of childhood, which is really fascinating. And I want to talk a little bit. You had mentioned um, Hannah Arendt, and I know you are sort of you've read, you're a devotee of Hannah Arendt, and you mentioned how she talks about this. Tell me a little bit about her perspective on this.
Well, she's really interesting because the way that she sees children, as she sees them as newcomers to the world, it's almost like you're traveling to a foreign country and you don't know anything, and you need someone to show you how it all works, and to kind of take you through the process of getting to know, what are the ways you behave, how do things work. How should I relate to other people? And so that's what childhood is about. It's about coming to understand the world that you have inherited, and that you will take forward at some point when you become an adult. And it's also about like learning to value that world, because if you don't value that world, you're not going to perpetuate. You're not going to perpetuate your family. You're not going to perpetuate yourself, and society will fall apart.
Well, it's a perfect segue because I don't think childhood is viewed this way anymore. I mean, what you've laid out is how I view childhood still, and how I think a lot of people view childhood. But increasingly now, I feel like kids, very, very young kids, are being introduced to very adult concepts. And you talk, and I think we can get to today, because I think what's interesting is you talk about how it fell apart in the 70s. And I'd love to kind of explain or explore that, but then talk about what's going on today, because I think we've had another sort of lurch into sort of attacking childhood and the innocence of kids in favor of making them activists, um, getting them, there's a walkout every other day. They're marching on Washington, whatever. You understand the power of children today, and there's sort of this imagery of Mao's Red Army, demanding these changes, which make me very, very uncomfortable. And so I do want to talk about that, but talk to me a little bit about what happened in the 70s with this concept of childhood
Right. Well,
and the family,
um,
and what happened to the
right.
family.
Okay. Well, the family is really key for this, because what the I guess the kind of backdrop to this is that, uh, sorry to go back, but in the
No,
late
do.
19th
I'm yeah.
century, in the late 19th century, you have this kind of crisis of, I suppose, meaning, that takes all sorts of different forms. I mean, this is what Freud is getting at, is when you don't know how to fit into society, you have a sort of a personal breakdown. But that sort of loss of of the bigger picture of the world and how you fit into it is something that, I mean, you can see it in Nietzsche, you can see it, all through the late 19th century, and you can even see it in the First and Second World Wars, actually, if you want to, take it that far. Um, but but the thing that kind of holds things together, to particularly in the United States, is that you still have families. And the important thing about the family as an institution, is that, on the one hand, it's really flexible. It's very adaptive. It's very adaptable. You can have divorces, but you can also kind of recover yourself because you have this institution that is bigger than the sum of its parts, and that was organized really around raising kids. And it's a wonderful way to raise kids because what it does is it creates this environment for them to naturally mature within, where they have to balance, where they learn to balance what they want with what their parents, who are an authority, say they must do, with their siblings, and sibling rivalries, sibling cherishing one another. I mean, there are all of these wonderful dynamics that are kind of held within the family. And they're held within the family because the family is not going away. At the time, before the 1970s, it was a permanent institution. And so, you could hate you could hate your brother, you could hate your sister, but they were always going to be there. And that held a space for reconciliation. It held a space for balance. And you could even have favorites, like now you would never dream of having, the favorite child, but you could have favorites and nobody was threatened by it because it was this permanent institution. And what happens in the 1970s is that a couple of things. I think this kind of crisis of meaning actually begins to erode private life. But then you have a catalyst in the change in the divorce laws. So it becomes very easy to divorce. And you have this real shift so that instead of thinking about the needs of children, we're thinking about the needs of adults. For adult self-actualization, for, them to go off and be with the one they really love and
Right.
start over.
Right.
And kids are really just disenfranchised through that. And that is important because that sets the scene for what happens later on. So what happens is that the family's no longer permanent. And there's this period where, on the one hand, there's not a lot of focus more broadly on the needs of children, and we start to, the rating system comes in. TV becomes more mature. We're not thinking that children could always be there. So we have that happening on the one hand, but on the other hand, we still have people struggling to raise their kids. And it's a real crisis point because it feels like you cannot look back to the past to know what to do because things are so different.
You the other thing that I really found interesting, and also we talked about this earlier, and I know you talked about this in your book, but also this idea of that you didn't live with and around your family. That in the 70s, this became more prevalent, that people moved away from their families. And so instead of and you and I talked about this because I think we both were raised in the 70s in families that had moved away. And I hardly saw my extended family. So it was very natural for me. But this was an unusual phenomenon. You usually stayed in your same town and lived your whole life around your family. And Nancy, I was sort of rereading things that we had talked about in the last podcast. It was so fascinating because you think about today, and I think you had mentioned, well, you might have to hang out with your annoying brother and your great uncle who's always making those off-color jokes. And, your Aunt Sue, who you don't really, whatever, you get it. The point is, but you still had to deal with these people. And so you actually got this lesson in dealing with people you don't agree with. Today, people choose their families essentially, because you talk about that too. You choose your family. And so you never have to, you choose to be around people that you like and never disagree with. And, maybe that's a little bit of why our country is so dysfunctional now, because we're choosing to sort of never hang out with people that we disagree with. So that muscle has atrophied. We don't even know how to disagree with people, but still like go to a picnic and have to hang out with them. So it's kind of interesting how, as the family has crumbled, so is our society and our ability for civil discourse. I don't know if you think that that's sort of
I
connected.
do. And I think what's so amazing about the family, when you have a family that is permanent, is that it's understanding that you get a really deep, rich understanding that it's not just about you and your choices. There is a given world, there are given circumstances that you need to find a way to deal with. And you need to do things like you need to learn to manage your emotions. You need to learn to focus on the things that you love about Uncle Bert, and and forgive, but maybe not forget the things that you don't like about Uncle Bert. And it does that completely organically. And I think that is what is so sort of reviled about the family now, is that it is a natural institution. I mean, it's amazing how we seem to think that you have to, everything now must be chosen. It must be a conscious decision. But if you have a room full of children and you have an adult come in, those kids are going to defer to the adult, because the adult has natural authority. And we're very suspicious of authority now, and we're particularly suspicious of the family. So you have, all of these people talking about the oppressiveness of the cis heteronormative family. But what that is that's just, it's just a natural form of authority that we have evolved really to recognize. And I think, that's why some people find it so threatening. Anyway, yeah, so you have to stop me because I'll just keep
no,
talking.
I had a 20-minute intro there, so I get it, because this is such an issue that I'm also sort of personally grappling with and trying to understand myself. But do you think that that's why we see what many people see as attacks on the family? This idea that schools now feel that it's okay to keep secrets from parents about significant matters. For instance, on the transgender issue, a child goes into the office and says, "I would now like to be called Michael instead of Michelle." And that school will change the records in the files, and we'll go along with whatever, and not notify the parents. The child could then say, like, I would like my records to show that. And to be honest with you, I don't know the technicalities of this. I don't know if they actually go in and change the records, but at least they will call that child by what they want to go by, and recognize that child as a boy if it's a biological girl, and allow that biological girl to go into the men's room, or vice versa. And again, never inform the parents about a significant emotional and mental health issue. Um, I Tell me where these two intersect. I mean, I think that this is being done to help sort of accelerate the destruction of the family. And I know that's like, that comment right there would be like, "You're a right-wing nut who's just spouting off about things." But I do think I think there are figures in this country that, again, don't like it as a challenge to government authority, or teacher authority, or whatever it is. I mean, if you could kind of, do you agree with that, or that
I
comment? Or
do. I mean, the way I see it. In fact, I wanted to coin a word, and everyone said don't. Don't coin that word, Nancy. But if I was going to coin this word, for me, what's going on now is very similar to misogyny, but it's against parents, which I believe, your Greek listeners will go nuts, would be misogynesis.
listen
So
to you.
it's like this kind of like uh, assumed prejudice against parents, that they're always wrong, they can do no right, and it's just a prejudice. Because I mean, if you look at the sort of issues involved in things like gender questioning, it's ironic, because a lot of it seems to be about young people trying to separate from their parents. And I mean, one thing I didn't mention is that when the family collapsed, um, the thing that kind of took its place was parenting, which is this very intense relationship, one-to-one relationship between each child and each parent. And in that sort of relationship, it can become very intense and overbearing. And so in some of these cases, it seems like this is the only way this is the kind of the social way now that young people separate from their parents. Unfortunately, it's been medicalized, so there are lifelong consequences to that, which, is just terrible. But but the thing is that whatever issues we have, those are issues that developed within the context of the family, and that is where they will be resolved most of the time. And it's really destructive to kids to separate them from their families, because no matter how difficult a relationship within a family is, it's a it is something that will be with you for the rest of your life.
Yes, but the thing is that that is the answer though to you've heard these um I don't know what the they use a phrase for it's like ghosting your family. You no
Oh,
longer
going no contact
going no contact. And we've seen some
or
creep.
estrangement.
Yeah, yes, and it's you will not speak to them. That's sort of the answer these days. I It's really sad because it's sort of and you see in some of these activists, there've actually been messages put out there, come to our community. We will be your parents. We will be your family. I hear these phrases. We will be your family. Or this is and in pop culture, in popular media, I see this stuff all the time. This is my chosen family, right? And and I think culturally that's really taken over in terms of your family's just who you were born to. You don't have to hang out with them. It's more than just my parents moved away, but we still had contact, but we didn't see them a lot. I mean, it is radically different than that. It's actually break away from your biological family and create a new family, which to me is so much worse. Um, it's so much more damaging. And again, I think it contributes to our inability to sort of deal with people who think differently than us. I mean, not us, but you get, you know, society in general.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with that, and it's interesting because I've watched this develop over the last 10 years or so, and it started out with just ordinary relationships, and it's like, I'm not getting along with my partner, or, I'm having difficulties, and the answer was always cut those toxic people out of your life. Um, and uh, it's a real problem because um, there's this sense there's a sense that relationships should only exist if they make you feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
And it and so it's like redefining the purpose of families away from this generational renewal and this kind of institution for redemption, in a sense, and it's making it about me and my needs, and just think about what that means for kids,
Well, I wanted to
because
ask, what does this mean? I mean,
yeah.
what so we've got this kind of cultural situation where we're introducing intensely adult subjects to kids at a very young age. I mean, kindergarteners are being read some pretty provocative books. We're seeing middle school libraries with and high school libraries with pornography in them. They're being told that things like sex don't matter, that gender, you can choose whatever gender you are. These are all very confusing concepts, and they're being encouraged to break from their parents if their parents don't agree with them off the bat. And I'm sort of talking about gender here, but this relates to other things too. It's not just gender. You have adults out there that are encouraging kids to break away from their parents if they disagree with them on anything. So that is a loss of one kind of authority, the parental authority, and then their kids are being told to sort of replace it with a teacher or some sort of official. What is this doing to kids, and what is this doing to the concept of childhood?
Well, to understand that, I think it's important to understand that or to think of this as a sort of a cutting off of the past, a sort of jettisoning of earlier generations, who had norms and who had values and things that developed over a long period of time to help us to function in the world. And really, since the 70s, we've had a very our culture has been very much in the now. And the only reason why we make reference to history or to what came before is if it serves the purposes of the now. Um, and so, so what that means is that it has this weird effect on society where on the one hand, you have adults who never grow up. Because they're never forced to think about the future. They're just living in the now. So you have a bunch of, sort of 50-year-old adolescents running around. But on the more destructive side, it pulls young children into the present and it treats them like adults. And so a lot of these people who go on about how they, and I think they really believe it. They want kids to understand consent. They want them to have this wonderful sex life. They want them to be, as adults, they want them to, be their authentic selves. But they have been so alienated from what childhood really is that they don't understand that it is absolutely impossible for kids to grasp that, to make sense of it, to understand the future implications of that. I mean, they just have no clue about what children are like. And it's so destructive because, you open that door. And I mean, I really do think, knowledge of sex is this kind of turning point for kids because it's such a strong thing in adult life. And it just pulls them into adult life way before they, can
Right.
handle it.
Well, and it pulls them, I mean, look, the way that we're pulling them into learning about sex and relationships isn't like this is kind of what happens, right? It is you have to choose what gender you are now. You can be anything you want. I mean, that in and of itself is kids are susceptible to suggestion. They are. And this idea,
Absolutely.
but it frustrates me so much because people say, well, if a child isn't, doesn't identify as another, another gender, then there's no problem. Or if the child isn't, gay or lesbian or whatever, then there's no problem, right? And it's like you can actually it's not necessarily introducing it's this whole new sort of category of queer, which is questioning, and I'm attracted to all sorts of things, and I'm attracted to, or I'm asexual and I'm not really attracted to any sex. The idea that the the
It's my
idea
son.
it's okay. It's okay. The idea that children are not susceptible and then it could create confusion in a child um, is just monstrous because again these concepts are very complicated for a full grown adult and to introduce them at such a young age. But again, I think that the tension that we're seeing between parents and some of these school administrators, for example, or government officials, I mean, you've got you know one undersecretary at HHS, Rachel Levine, who she is a very powerful government official who is trans herself and is saying that we should introduce these concepts to kids. So it's not just teachers. I mean, we're talking about very powerful government officials who are introducing these concepts. And I think for me and for others, other parents out there, were like, when did this become okay? And they're not only just suggesting it, they're actually fighting parents who object to it. So and again, it all comes at the cost of children and families and this concept of childhood. Nancy, I wanted to ask you, you are kind of interested in examining this you're a little further and you've got a new project. I don't know if this is a new book, but you're working on a new project sort of around this idea. Tell us a little bit about it.
Right. Well, when I was writing my book about parenting, when I understood what a crucial role the family played, I wanted to understand that better. And just a bit of background, one of the reasons why I was interested in parenting is that I've always been interested in families. My father was in the military. We lived lots of different places, and I used to love to visit other families because it was like this new world, everything, they did things differently. They had different words for things. Things smelled a little bit differently. And so I've always found that really fascinating. But when I started to understand a bit better the important role that the family played, I really wanted to understand what had happened over time with it and where it was going. And what I realized, and this is kind of where Hannah Arendt comes into it again, is that I was having an argument on Twitter, and someone said to me, "Well, you just want to go back to the 1950s." And I said, "Well, no." But I was thinking about why is it
Why
when
is it bad?
when people why is it it's always, why not go back to the 70s or the 80s and I think the reason why is that the 50s was the last time when the traditions that the family was based on were intact. And those traditions are gone now. I mean, there was a break, they are gone. People
It's
don't
interesting.
understand them.
It's interesting too when you say the 50s. I also think of pop culture. I always think of like pop culture and what was it like? And you think about those television shows which reflected that sort of, nuclear family, mom, dad, kids, um and that sort of unit and how important that was and again those that they would even have. I mean, they do have. I feel like every series now that has to do with the family is so sarcastic and has to sort of make
Mhm.
fun of the family and at least make fun of the dad always, He's always so stupid and the mom is always so bright. But just the idea of a television show that not didn't make fun of the family, but showed the challenges and the laughs and the good things about having a family and sort of these charming little vignettes, so I yeah, so it's sort of the culture also has never or pop culture certainly is not the same either. The message people get from television today is that's square and, you know, it's not the
Yeah, no,
cool
it's
way.
it's really true. And then you have these sort of you have I mean, it's interesting. You take something like Friends, and I mean, what that is it's basically a family, but it's not a family.
Yep.
Um, and uh, and that, which is when we could have a whole podcast on that. but but uh, but but anyway, so uh, because we can't go back to that, and I actually don't think we understand it, and why it worked, which is part of what I want to do is these calls to defend the family don't really grab people in the way that you would think they do. Because I mean, we grew up in the 70s. I mean, how many people are there around who even, have even experienced the idea of the family as being something permanent? I mean, it just does not, it's just beyond people's experience now. And what Hannah Arendt did was she talked about this more broadly as a problem of Western society. She says, you have a break with tradition, and then you have terrible things happen like totalitarianism and all of these different effects that has. Um, and so what she said is that what we need to do is we need to rediscover um, uh, that tradition and build a new one. And so she likens it to diving for buried treasure. And so there's this thing which is lost. You go back, you bring up these objects. Sometimes you don't know what they did. You don't know how they worked. Sometimes you can find a use for them. Sometimes you can't. But through that, you build something new. You build something new that is right for you and for your society going forward. And so, what I would like to do is I would like to dive into the tradition of the family, because I think the family is kind of the first institution. It's the institution where we, in whatever way, we pass on a sense of who we are and how we are in the world and what the world is like to a next generation so that they can carry on. And so rather than defending the family, I want to make the case for the family. And part of that, and probably the most urgent part of that, is making the case for childhood and understanding that, in a sense, childhood is also like that buried treasure. Because I was thinking about this, and I realized that there's not a day that goes by when I don't go back into the magic sack that is my childhood and take out something and use that as the benchmark, or compare it. I mean, it's like this kind of treasure that you have that allows you to to adapt.
And
And
cope.
yes, and we have a mental health crisis today, I believe, because we have micromanaged childhood so intensely that kids don't fill up that sack. They don't have the experiences that they can draw on, or they don't have as much that they can draw on. Um, and and I and if you haven't had both positive and negative experiences, if you haven't been allowed to learn lessons for yourself in the sandbox, I mean, there's a reason why software developments talk about doing things in the sandbox, is that you can play and there aren't big consequences for that. But we've got to the point where it's weirdly, we treat everything in childhood as if it has these massive consequences.
Yeah.
And so, you see the parents kind of micromanaging in the sandbox, but really, kids need to go through those experiences within a larger, safer environment, when the stakes are not very high, in order to learn to manage their emotions, to learn to get a sense of self-possession, and to, create the basis for a healthy adulthood, to
Well,
have those resources to draw on.
and what's so, I think, dangerous is we've got this just incredible contagion of especially young girls i- deciding on what gender they want to be, or deciding to switch their gender before they've really matured fully, and they don't have a full bag from which to draw lessons, or um, you know uh, coping mechanisms, or what have you. I love that imagery of a bag that you can kind of go into and pull out, memories of, how you handled these different situations, how your parents handled these different situations. But childhood gives you that bag, that of tools, essentially. And I feel like we aren't allowing children to develop that set of tools nowadays before we're presenting them with incredibly adult decisions that can change their lives. So, that coupled with learning loss, that coupled with the mental health crisis, it worries me a lot for children today. I think it does you
Well,
too.
it does, and it's insidious because, on the one hand, I mean, just take gender. Um, when when we arrive in the world, the first thing that happens is that we are claimed as one sex or another, recognized. And I mean, it's when it and that's something that we just do as human beings. When we know that a child is male or female, we treat them differently, and we're not even aware we're doing it, which is a real problem for people trying to do research on gender. Is that, any clue, and the researchers will notice different things, and those things will track with, like what we believe about, men and women, boys and girls. Um, but for kids, it's really important to have that, and to have that confirmed, because the one thing that a little kid knows from about the age of 4 is, I am a girl or I am a boy.
Mhm.
And that is where, like the Disney princesses come from, the trucks, the sort of, picking the most sort of like over the top
Right.
stereotype of sex, and loving that. Or even if you're a gender nonconforming kid,
Yeah.
and the vast majority of those kids grow up to be gay,
Yes.
even so, they draw on that binary.
Yes.
And when you get
Yes.
rid of that binary, it really destabilizes people's personalities. It's
Yes.
just like it's like pulling the rug out, and
Yes.
suddenly, you're a 5-year-old kid and you can be anything. I
But
mean,
again,
how horrible is that?
how horrible, and again, but it's interesting, I can't get over I think about that bag you're talking about. We have we've taken away their bag. I mean, for when they're an adult, because in ruining their childhood,
Well,
introducing these incredibly adult concepts to them, we haven't allowed them to develop naturally into adults who is able to look back on these things and kind of figure things out. It really is a tragedy that I think we're gonna be paying for generations.
well, I mean, the worst thing about it is I think we've deprived them of hope because, um, I think there's something really important about wonder. And with little kids, everything is a wonder. And instead of allowing kids to understand things and figure things out in their own terms, we're so we're so eager to correct them and to prepare them to be adults. And so, instead of sex being this thing that you sort of know is out there, but it's this mystery. Instead of allowing that to be a mystery, it's like, well, this is what happens, and just specifying that. It's also like, I mean, another example is Santa Claus. I mean, you get these people who are like, well, you're lying to children, and and yeah, it's a vast adult conspiracy that we do, that we do, so that for a time in our children's lives, they understand, they have this childhood belief, they have this
Right.
innocent belief
Right.
that that
Reindeers that
and
that that they fly, right? I mean,
they
it's
do, and
it's
and
wonderful.
and and they it will eventually come to understand that the truth about Santa themselves, and then maybe we tell them at some point,
Well,
just
and
confirm what
there's
they're
also
telling us.
there's a reason parents do it. It's like, I can't even I actually found an app on my phone that you could talk to Santa, and I used it. I mean, it'd be the heat of July, and I'd be sitting there, I'm getting Santa on the phone. I mean, there is this concept of, like, if you're a good boy or girl all year, Santa will bring you something. He will recognize your goodness, right? And you're not on the naughty list. I mean, it's not just like, "Oh, we like
Yeah, I
messing with."
have the naughty list app.
Yeah.
Oh, you're on the naughty list. I
Yes,
think you
yes,
should
see?
stop that.
I tell you, parenting is so easy these days, but I'm telling you, this is the kind of thing that there was a greater meaning there beyond just like, let's have fun and mess with the kids and tell them that reindeer and there's like elves. Like, there was a lesson behind it. And again, you're right that giving them this idea, to think about, oh my gosh, Santa, and they go to sleep and they wait for the hooves, to be on their roof. I mean, it's wonderful. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's
Yeah,
part of
and it's
childhood. Yeah.
it is, and it's like, I mean, childhood is a gift we give to the younger generation, and we have really taken that gift away. um, and it's been well-meaning. We as adults, we know the realities of the world, and in a way, it's a sort of a lack of confidence in ourselves. So that instead of having confidence in our ability to protect our children, we feel like, wow, it's all on the internet. Let's just prepare them. That's all we
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah.
And in preparing them, we actually rob them, of that time of uh, uh, without pressure, when they can mature at their own rate, and when they don't have to be thinking about these very adult things that they frankly, can't comprehend, or can't engage in without seriously harming themselves.
Well, listen,
Um,
Nancy, this is probably a good place to wrap up. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to once again plug your book and tell people where they can find you on social media.
Right. Well, my book is The Problem with Parenting, which is published by Prager Press. It's available on Amazon. And you can find me on Twitter and at NMCDNY at twitter.com. I have an old
Now,
handle.
everyone should know that Nancy, I didn't read your full bio, which will be on the podcast landing page. But Nancy used to be one of the administrators of the Park Slope Moms Group. Was it Parents Group or Moms Group?
It's Parents, Park Slope Parents.
Yeah, which is, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, like, that's quite a job.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the largest in the country, and and in your New York City, and everyone's a journalist, everyone's writing, is winning Oscars, and
Right,
this is very sort of
yeah,
type A parents.
yeah. Which is
And
where
so
but that's where you're the New York on your Twitter handle.
yes. And
Yes.
so that's the NYC. I'm not in NYC anymore. I'm not in the country now, but
Well, I look forward to your coming book on childhood, the destruction of childhood, the importance of childhood, the reason we
well, if anybody wants to publish it, it's still,
I will read it.
Yeah.
Well, and when that does happen, you can come back on and talk about it. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh,
This
it's
is
so fun. It's
a great topic.
so lovely.
I know we didn't scratch the surface, but I appreciate you coming on.
Well, and I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Bye.
Bye. The Bespoke Parenting Podcast with Julie Gunlock is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. You can send a comment and question to julie.gunlock@iwf.org. Please help me and IWF by hitting the subscribe button and leaving a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or IWF.org. Hang in there, parents, and go bespoke.